Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells, where we explore the brilliant mind and extraordinary cases of the world's greatest detective, Hercule Poirot. Tonight, we present a tale of glittering society, shattered crystal, and death served in the finest Venetian glass. A case where the murder weapon was as beautiful as it was deadly, and where the killer's signature became their ultimate undoing. So settle in, pour yourself a tisane, or perhaps something stronger, and let us begin. This is the Crystal Goblet Killer. Chapter 1. The First Victim. The body of Sir Rupert Ashby lay sprawled across the Persian carpet of his Belgravia study, one hand still clutching the stem of what had once been an exquisite crystal goblet. The glass had shattered when he fell, scattering fragments across the floor like frozen tears. But enough remained in his grip to identify it as a piece of extraordinary craftsmanship. Venetian crystal, hand-blown, with delicate gold filigree worked into the base. Hercule Poirot stood in the doorway, his keen green eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. He had been summoned by Chief Inspector Japp, who stood nearby with an expression of profound unease, and he understood immediately why his old friend had requested his assistance. This was no ordinary murder. This was something theatrical, something deliberate, something that spoke of a killer with both refined taste and ice-cold calculation. He was found this morning by his valet, Japp explained, his voice low. The study door was locked from the inside. The valet had to break it down when Sir Rupert didn't respond to his knock. The windows are latched, no sign of forced entry anywhere. By all appearances, Sir Rupert was alone when he died. And yet, he did not die alone, Poirot murmured, stepping carefully into the room. Someone was with him. Someone who gave him that goblet. Someone who watched him drink from it. Someone who waited for the poison to do its work before making their escape.
Poison? You're certain?
Observe the victim's face, mon ami. The cyanosis around the lips, the expression of sudden shock, the position of the body. He was standing when the poison took effect, standing and drinking, enjoying whatever was in that beautiful glass. And then, within moments, he was dead. Poirot crouched beside the body, careful not to disturb the scattered crystal.
The goblet itself is significant. This is not an ordinary drinking vessel. This is a work of art, worth hundreds of pounds at least. It was chosen deliberately, either as a gift or as a message. A message? Consider, Japp. If one wishes simply to poison a man, there are 1,000 ways to do so. A cup of tea, a glass of wine, a meal prepared by one's cook. But this killer chose to use a crystal goblet of exceptional beauty and value. A goblet that the victim would have noticed, admired, perhaps even commented upon before drinking from it. That suggests the goblet itself was important to the killer. It was part of the ritual, part of the meaning.
Japp scratched his head. You're saying this wasn't just murder? It was... what? Performance?
Perhaps. Or perhaps revenge, served in a vessel that held special significance for both killer and victim.
Poirot straightened and looked around the study.
Tell me about Sir Rupert Ashby. Who was he? What enemies might he have had?
He was a financier, one of the wealthiest men in London. Made his fortune in banking and investments, though there were always rumours that his methods weren't entirely above board. Sharp practices, ruthless dealings, the kind of thing that makes a man rich but not popular. Japp consulted his notebook. He was 63 years old, widowed, no children.
His wife died 5 years ago. Natural causes, according to the records. He lived here alone, except for a small staff. The valet who found him, a cook, 2 housemaids,
And a driver. And his social circle? His associates? He was a member of several clubs, the Carlton, the Reform, a few others. He entertained regularly, though his guests tended to be business associates rather than personal friends. From what we've gathered, he wasn't a man who inspired affection. A man with money, power, and few friends. Such men often have enemies. Poirot moved to the desk, where a leather appointment book lay open. "May I?" "Be my guest. We haven't had time to go through it properly yet." Poirot examined the book, his eyebrows rising as he read the entries. Sir Rupert had a busy schedule. Meetings, dinners, appointments with lawyers and accountants. But here, he pointed to an entry from 2 days before. He had dinner with someone identified only as V. No surname, no additional details. And here, the day before his death, another meeting with this same V at his club. We'll need to find out who that is. Indeed. And we should also examine this goblet more closely. Poirot gestured to the broken crystal. Have the fragments collected and sent to a laboratory. I want to know everything about this glass, where it was made, when, and, if possible, who purchased it. If the goblet was a gift, as I suspect, then tracing its origin may lead us to the killer. The investigation into the goblet's provenance proved surprisingly fruitful. Within 24 hours, Poirot had established that the crystal was indeed Venetian, manufactured by the prestigious Barovier Glassworks on the island of Murano. It was part of a limited series of 12 goblets, commissioned in 1925 by a private collector. A collector whose name sent a chill down Poirot's spine when he heard it. The goblets were commissioned by Lord Marcus Pemberton, he told Japp that evening. A man who died 3 years ago under circumstances that were never fully explained. Pemberton? That name sounds familiar. It should. Lord Pemberton was one of Sir Rupert Ashby's business partners in the 1920s. They were involved together in a banking venture that collapsed spectacularly in 1929, ruining thousands of investors. Pemberton lost everything: his fortune, his reputation, his health. He died in a charity hospital, alone and penniless, while Ashby emerged from the disaster with his wealth intact. You're saying Ashby cheated his partner? I am saying that many people believed so at the time. There were accusations, investigations, even talk of criminal charges. But nothing was ever proven, and Ashby continued his career while Pemberton faded into obscurity. Poirot's expression was grave. If someone is using Pemberton's goblets to kill Ashby, it suggests a connection to that old scandal. Perhaps someone who lost money in the collapse, or a relative of someone who suffered. Or a relative of Pemberton himself. Precisely. Lord Pemberton had a son, I believe, a young man who would now be in his early 30s. We must find him, Japp. He may be our killer, or he may be our next victim. Chapter 2. The Second Goblet. They were too late. The body of Charles Worthington, a prominent solicitor with offices in Lincoln's Inn, was discovered the following morning by his secretary. Like Sir Rupert Ashby, he had been found alone in a locked room, clutching the shattered remains of a crystal goblet. Like Ashby, he had died from what appeared to be cyanide poisoning, the telltale blue tinge around his lips, confirming the cause of death before any autopsy could be performed. Poirot examined the scene with a growing sense of urgency. The pattern was now unmistakable. A serial killer was at work, someone who targeted their victims with deliberate care and dispatched them using the same distinctive method. The crystal goblets were a signature, a calling card, a message that the killer wanted the world to understand. Worthington was Ashby's solicitor, Japp reported, having spent the morning gathering information about the victim. He handled all of Ashby's legal affairs for the past 15 years, including the aftermath of the Pemberton collapse. So, the connection is confirmed. Both victims were involved in the scandal that destroyed Lord Pemberton. Poirot picked up a fragment of crystal from the floor, turning it over in his gloved hands.
The same craftsmanship, the same gold filigree. This goblet is from the same set as the one that killed Ashby.
12 goblets in the set, you said. That means the killer could have 10 more victims planned.
If they intend to use all 12, yes. But we must not assume that is their plan. The goblets may simply be a convenient supply of murder weapons, chosen for their symbolic significance rather than their number.
Poirot set down the crystal fragment. Tell me more about Worthington. What was his role in the Pemberton affair?
He was the one who structured the deal that allowed Ashby to escape liability. He created a maze of shell companies and trusts that protected Ashby's assets while leaving Pemberton and the other investors exposed. It was technically legal, but morally...
Japp shook his head. There were people who wanted Worthington disbarred. He received death threats for years afterward.
And yet he continued to work for Ashby. Loyalty or complicity?
Both, probably. Worthington made a fortune from the arrangement. Ashby paid him handsomely for his services. They were partners in crime, if not in the legal sense. Poirot nodded slowly, his grey cells working through the implications.
So, we have a killer who is targeting those responsible for the Pemberton collapse, using goblets that belonged to Pemberton himself. The motive is clearly revenge. But revenge on behalf of whom? Lord Pemberton is dead. His family?
His son is still alive. We've been trying to locate him.
And?
He disappeared about 6 months ago, sold his flat in Chelsea, resigned from his position at a shipping company, and vanished without a trace. No forwarding address, no contact with friends or family. It's as though he simply ceased to exist. Or transformed himself into something new. A man who plans a campaign of murder might well take steps to conceal his identity beforehand. Poirot's expression was grim.
We must find him, Japp, before he strikes again.
But even as Poirot spoke those words, he knew that finding the killer would not be simple. Someone who had planned so carefully, who had executed 2 murders without leaving a trace of evidence, who had somehow gained access to locked rooms and departed without being seen. Such a person was not likely to make obvious mistakes. The Crystal Goblet Killer, as the newspapers had begun to call him, was a phantom. And catching a phantom would require all of Poirot's considerable abilities. Chapter 3. The List. The investigation into the Pemberton collapse of 1929 revealed a web of corruption and betrayal that was even more extensive than Poirot had initially suspected. Sir Rupert Ashby had not acted alone in his scheme to defraud investors. He had been part of a consortium of businessmen who had systematically looted the partnership's assets, while leaving Lord Pemberton to bear the blame. Poirot assembled the list of conspirators with the help of old financial records and the testimony of those who remembered the scandal. There had been 7 men in total who had profited from Pemberton's destruction. Sir Rupert Ashby, the financier, now dead. Charles Worthington, the solicitor, now dead. Geoffrey Blake, the accountant who had falsified the partnership's books. Victor Harrington, the banker who had facilitated the transfer of assets. Edmund Cross, the stockbroker who had manipulated the market to trigger the collapse. Arthur Pemberton, Lord Pemberton's own brother, who had betrayed him for a share of the profits. And finally, a 7th man whose identity had been carefully concealed, referred to in the documents only as the silent partner, someone who had provided the initial capital for the scheme and had taken the largest share of the proceeds.
7 conspirators,
Poirot mused, studying the list.
2 are already dead. That leaves 5 potential victims, assuming the killer intends to work through the entire list.
We've placed all of them under police protection, Japp said. Round-the-clock surveillance, guards at their homes and offices. If the killer tries to strike again, we'll be ready.
I hope you are right, mon ami. But this killer has already demonstrated a remarkable ability to bypass security. Both Ashby and Worthington were found in locked rooms with no sign of forced entry. Either the killer possesses some means of access that we have not discovered, or they were admitted willingly by their victims.
Admitted willingly? You mean the victims knew their killer?
Consider the goblets. These are not ordinary glasses, they are works of art, immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the Pemberton collection. If someone appeared at your door carrying such a goblet and offering a toast, would you not be suspicious? Would you not wonder why they were using that particular glass?
Unless I didn't know about the connection. Unless I thought it was just a beautiful goblet with no special significance.
But Ashby and Worthington would have known. They were intimately involved in the Pemberton affair. They would have recognized the goblets immediately. And yet, they drank from them anyway.
Poirot shook his head.
No, something does not fit. Either the victims were unaware of the goblet's origin, which seems unlikely, or they trusted the person who offered them the drink enough to override their suspicions.
Someone they knew. Someone they trusted.
Exactly. Which brings us back to the question of who might occupy that position.
The killer has access to the Pemberton goblets, suggesting a connection to the family. They have knowledge of the conspiracy, suggesting familiarity with the events of 1929. And they have the ability to approach their victims without arousing suspicion, suggesting either a disguise or a legitimate relationship. Lord Pemberton's son fits all those criteria. He does. But we must not fixate too quickly on any single suspect. There may be others with similar qualifications. A former servant, perhaps, or a lover, or someone else who was close to Lord Pemberton during his final years. Poirot rose from his chair.
I should like to visit the remaining men on our list. Not to warn them, they have already been warned, but to observe them, to understand who they are and what they might know about the killer's identity.
You think one of them might know who's doing this?
I think one of them might be involved in ways we have not yet considered. Remember, Japp, there were 7 conspirators, and one of them betrayed his own brother. In such a group, loyalty is clearly not a virtue. If the killer has an accomplice among the survivors...
He left the thought unfinished, but Japp understood the implication. The Crystal Goblet Killer might not be working alone. Chapter 4. The Survivors. Geoffrey Blake, the accountant, received Poirot in the sitting room of his modest house in Hampstead. He was a nervous man in his 60s, with thin grey hair and hands that trembled slightly as he poured tea.
"I've been expecting something like this for years,"
he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Ever since Marcus died, I've had this feeling, this premonition, that someone would come for us eventually. We destroyed him, you know. Not just his fortune, but his spirit. The man we buried was a shell, a ghost of what he had been. You feel guilty for your part in his destruction."
"Guilty?" Blake laughed bitterly.
"I feel damned, Monsieur Poirot. I sold my soul for money."
"And I've been paying for it ever since. The nightmares, the anxiety, the constant fear that someone would discover what we did. And now someone has discovered it, or remembered it at least, and they're making us pay the ultimate price." "Tell me about the conspiracy. How did it begin?" Blake was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of his comfortable sitting room. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with the weight of old secrets. "It began with Ashby. He was the one who saw the opportunity, the one who conceived the plan. Marcus Pemberton was a brilliant man, but he was also naive. He trusted his partners, trusted his advisors, trusted that everyone was working toward the same goal. Ashby exploited that trust. He convinced Marcus to invest heavily in a shipping venture that he knew was doomed to fail, while secretly positioning himself to profit from the collapse." "And you helped him falsify the accounts?" "I made the numbers say what Ashby wanted them to say. It wasn't difficult. Marcus never looked closely at the books, never questioned the figures I presented. He believed what he wanted to believe, and I let him believe it." "What about the others? How were they involved?" "Worthington handled the legal work, creating the structures that protected Ashby's assets. Harrington provided the banking services, moving money through accounts in Switzerland and the Channel Islands. Cross manipulated the stock prices, triggering the crash at precisely the right moment. And Arthur..." Blake's voice dropped even lower. "Arthur was the one who convinced Marcus to make the final investment, the one that wiped him out completely. His own brother, Monsieur Poirot. His own flesh and blood." "And the seventh man, the silent partner?" Blake's face went pale. "I don't know who that was. None of us did, except Ashby." "The silent partner provided the initial capital, nearly £1 million, and took half the profits when the scheme succeeded. But his identity was never revealed, not even to those of us who were part of the conspiracy." "You never wondered? Never tried to discover who he was?" "I wondered, certainly. We all did. But Ashby was adamant that the silent partner's identity must remain secret. He said it was for our protection as much as theirs, that if we didn't know who they were, we couldn't be forced to reveal them." Blake shuddered. "I always assumed it was someone powerful, someone with connections that went beyond mere money, someone who could destroy us all if we ever betrayed them." "And now someone is destroying you anyway." "Yes, the irony is not lost on me, I assure you." Poirot studied the accountant's face, searching for any sign of deception. What he found instead was genuine terror, the bone-deep fear
of a man who had lived with guilt for decades and was now watching that guilt take physical form. "You have police protection now," Poirot said. "You should be safe, at least for the moment." "Safe?" Blake shook his head. "I'll never be safe, Monsieur Poirot. Not from the killer, and not from my own conscience. Whatever happens, I've earned it. We all have." Victor Harrington, the banker, was a different sort entirely. He received Poirot in the boardroom of his private bank in the city, surrounded by portraits of distinguished predecessors and the heavy mahogany furniture that spoke of old money and older traditions. "I don't know what you expect me to tell you," he said, his voice cold and precise. "Yes, I was involved in the Pemberton affair. Yes, I profited from it. But I did nothing illegal, nothing that could be prosecuted in a court of law. If someone has decided to take revenge outside the legal system, that is their crime, not mine. 2 of your co-conspirators are dead, Monsieur Harrington. Does that not concern you?" "It concerns me greatly. That's why I've agreed to police protection, despite the inconvenience it causes my business. But I refuse to wallow in guilt like some of the others. What we did to Marcus Pemberton was regrettable, perhaps, but it was also business. He took a risk, he lost, and we won. That's how the financial world works. You feel no remorse?" "I feel whatever is appropriate for a man who played by the rules of his profession. Marcus Pemberton was not an innocent victim. He was a wealthy aristocrat who gambled with money he could afford to lose. The fact that he lost more than he expected is unfortunate, but it doesn't make us murderers. And yet, someone clearly disagrees with your assessment." Harrington's composure flickered just for a moment. "Someone is clearly unhinged, Monsieur Poirot. Someone who has fixated on an old scandal and decided to play judge, jury, and executioner. That person will be caught and punished, and the rest of us will go on with our lives. Unless the killer catches you first. That won't happen. My security is excellent, and I have no intention of letting strangers into my home or accepting drinks from anyone I don't know personally. Whoever is doing this has been clever so far, but cleverness has its limits." Poirot left Harrington's bank with a sense of unease that he could not quite explain. The man's arrogance was remarkable, even by the standards of wealthy financiers, but there was something else. Some note of false confidence that suggested Harrington was not as secure as he pretended to be. The remaining conspirators proved equally complex. Edmund Cross, the stockbroker, had retired to the countryside and now spent his days tending roses and pretending the past had never happened. He refused to speak about the Pemberton affair at all, claiming that his memory had failed and he could no longer remember the details. Arthur Pemberton, Lord Marcus's treacherous brother, had left England entirely. He was living in South Africa, according to the latest reports, having fled the country shortly after his brother's death. Whether he was hiding from guilt or from something more concrete, no one could say. And the 7th man, the silent partner, remained a mystery, a shadow figure whose identity might hold the key to the entire case. Extended. The investigation deepens. The days following the discovery of the Pemberton connection were filled with feverish activity. Poirot established a temporary headquarters in a conference room at Scotland Yard, where he could coordinate the various threads of the investigation with Inspector Japp and the team of officers assigned to the case. The walls were soon covered with photographs, documents, and hastily drawn diagrams showing the relationships between the various players in this deadly drama. At the centre of it all was a photograph of Lord Marcus Pemberton,
a handsome man with kind eyes and an expression that suggested both intelligence and a certain naive trust that had ultimately proven his undoing. He was beloved by everyone who knew him, Poirot observed, studying the photograph. His servants spoke of him with genuine affection. His business associates praised his integrity and fairness. Even his competitors respected him, though they did not always agree with his methods. "Which makes what happened to him all the more tragic," Japp replied. "A good man destroyed by those he trusted most." Indeed, and that, I think, is what drives our killer. Not merely the financial loss, not merely the public disgrace, but the betrayal of trust. The knowledge that Marcus Pemberton was murdered by his own friends and family, by the very people who should have protected him. The investigation into the remaining conspirators revealed a pattern that was both enlightening and disturbing. Each of the men who had participated in the Pemberton scheme had gone on to build successful careers, accumulating wealth and respectability, while their victim languished in poverty. They had attended the same clubs, moved in the same social circles, maintained the appearance of friendship and mutual regard. But beneath that appearance, Poirot detected currents of tension and mistrust. The conspirators had never fully trusted each other after what they had done, each aware that the others knew their darkest secret, each wondering when that knowledge might be used against them. They were bound together by guilt, Poirot observed. Each one afraid to break with the others, afraid that any sign of independence might trigger revelations that would destroy them all. It was a conspiracy of mutual assured destruction. And now that destruction has begun. The search for additional information about Vivian Pemberton led Poirot to interview several people who had known her during her years in England. Lady Harrington was the most forthcoming, but others provided valuable details as well. Mrs. Eleanor Worthington, the widow of the murdered solicitor, remembered Vivian from charity events in the late 1940s. She was quiet, reserved, almost mousy. Not the kind of woman you'd notice in a crowd. But there was something in her eyes, a watchfulness, an intensity, that struck me even then. I remember thinking she seemed like someone who was waiting for something. Did you ever suspect her connection to the Pemberton family? Never. She introduced herself as Vivian Ashford, and I had no reason to doubt her. The Ashfords were a respectable family with no obvious connection to the old scandal. It wasn't until you told me that I realized she must have been hiding her true identity all along. Did she ever ask about your husband? About his work, his clients, his history? Mrs. Worthington hesitated. She did ask questions sometimes. At the time, I thought she was simply being polite, showing interest in what Charles did. But looking back, I can see she was gathering information, learning about the people who had destroyed her family, studying them for what she eventually did. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Vivian's meticulous planning. Bank records showed regular withdrawals of cash over the past several years, money that could have been used to rent safe houses, purchase supplies, and maintain the anonymous existence that allowed her to move through London without detection. She had opened accounts under multiple names: Victoria Morrison, Virginia Moore, Valerie Martin, all using the initial V that would later become her signature. Each identity was carefully documented, with forged references and false employment histories that would have withstood casual scrutiny. She created an entire network of false identities, Hastings marveled, examining the evidence. She could disappear at will, become someone new whenever she needed to. No wonder we couldn't find her. She learned survival during the war, Poirot replied. In occupied France, such skills were not merely useful, they were essential. Those who could not hide, could not change their identities, could not move without detection, they did not survive. Vivian adapted those skills to a different purpose, but the underlying principle remained the same. Become invisible, become someone else, become whatever you need to be to achieve your goal. Chapter 5. Extended Psychological Profile. As the investigation progressed, Poirot found himself increasingly fascinated by the psychological profile of the Crystal Goblet Killer. This was not an ordinary murderer motivated by greed or passion or momentary rage. This was someone who had shaped their entire existence around the pursuit of revenge. Someone for whom killing had become not merely a means to an end, but a sacred obligation. He consulted with Dr. Heinrich Weber, a psychiatrist who specialized in criminal psychology and who had assisted Poirot on several previous cases. What you're describing is a form of obsessional pathology, Dr. Weber explained. The subject has constructed an elaborate fantasy in which she is the instrument of justice, righting wrongs that the conventional legal system has failed to address. In her mind, the murders are not crimes, but acts of righteousness, necessary sacrifices in service of a higher purpose. Can such a person be reasoned with? Can they be persuaded to stop? It depends on how deeply the obsession has taken root. In some cases, the fantasy becomes so integral to the subject's sense of identity that they cannot abandon it without feeling that they are abandoning themselves. For such individuals, the pursuit of revenge is not merely something they do, it is who they are. And if the revenge cannot be completed, if the final target escapes, then the subject faces a crisis. Their entire purpose has been thwarted, their life's work rendered meaningless. Some will simply collapse, fall into depression or catatonia, unable to function in a world that no longer makes sense. Others will redirect their energy, finding new targets or new justifications for their campaign of violence. And some, Dr. Weber paused, some will turn their violence inward. Having failed to destroy their enemies, they will destroy themselves. This assessment haunted Poirot as he continued his investigation. Vivian Pemberton had dedicated decades to her quest for revenge, sacrificing everything: her identity, her relationships, her chance at a normal life, for the satisfaction of killing the men who had destroyed her family. If that quest was thwarted, what would become of her? And, more immediately, how many more people might die before she was stopped? The psychological profile also raised troubling questions about Julian Pemberton, Vivian's cousin, who had disappeared 6 months ago. Had his disappearance been connected to Vivian's campaign of revenge? Was he a victim, an accomplice, or something else entirely? There are 3 possibilities, Poirot told Jab. First, Julian discovered what Vivienne was planning and chose to distance himself from her, to disappear rather than become complicit in murder. Second, Julian is actively assisting Vivienne, helping her plan and execute her crimes. Third, Julian has attempted to stop Vivienne and has paid the price for his interference. You think she might have killed her own cousin? I think someone willing to kill 3 strangers would not hesitate to kill a family member who stood in her way. But I do not believe Julian is dead. The telegram that was sent to Arthur Pemberton, Julian dead, come immediately, suggests that someone is using Julian's name to lure Arthur back to England. If Julian were truly dead, how would the sender know? And if Julian is alive,
Why would someone pretend otherwise?
Unless Julian sent the telegram himself.
Exactly. Julian may be trying to stop Vivienne in his own way, by luring Arthur into a situation where the police can intervene, or by forcing a confrontation that will end the killing once and for all.
Chapter 6. Extended. The web tightens. The investigation into the silent partner consumed several days as Poirot and his team worked through the labyrinthine financial records of the Pemberton collapse. The conspiracy had been deliberately designed to obscure the flow of money, with shell companies and offshore accounts creating a maze that would have defeated less determined investigators. But Poirot was nothing if not determined. He enlisted the help of a retired banker named Aldous Crane, who had been a contemporary of the original conspirators and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the financial practices of the era. The structure they used was sophisticated for its time, Crane explained, studying the documents Poirot had assembled. Multiple layers of ownership, each one designed to distance the principals from the underlying assets. It would have been almost impossible to trace the money back to its source using the methods available in 1929. But now? Now, with the benefit of hindsight and access to records that were sealed at the time, yes, I think we can identify the silent partner. The key is this holding company here. He pointed to one of the documents. It was ostensibly owned by a Swiss trust, but the beneficial owner was never disclosed. If we can trace the trust's formation documents, we should be able to identify who was really behind it. The trail led through Zurich and Geneva, through dusty archives and reluctant bankers who had to be persuaded to reveal information they had guarded for decades. But eventually, the truth emerged. A truth that was even more shocking than Poirot had anticipated. The beneficial owner of the Swiss trust had been Arthur Pemberton, not acting on behalf of others, but as the principal, the mastermind who had conceived the entire scheme and recruited the other conspirators to help him execute it. He destroyed his own brother, Poirot murmured, staring at the documents that proved Arthur's guilt. Not for money. He gained almost nothing in the end. But for what? Power? Jealousy? Some ancient grievance that festered until it became murderous. The investigation into the relationship between the Pemberton brothers revealed a history of sibling rivalry that had begun in childhood and had never truly ended. Arthur, the younger brother, had always lived in Marcus's shadow, less intelligent, less charming, less successful in everything he attempted. He had resented his brother's easy success, his happy marriage, his position as heir to the family title and estates. When the opportunity arose to destroy Marcus and seize everything he had, Arthur had taken it. He had spent years planning the conspiracy, recruiting partners who shared his greed, if not his personal hatred, and executing a scheme so complex that its true author would never be discovered. But he miscalculated, Poirot observed. He thought he would inherit everything when Marcus fell. The money, the title, the respect. Instead, he inherited nothing but debt and disgrace. Marcus had mortgaged the estates to fund his doomed investments, and when the collapse came, there was nothing left to inherit. So Arthur fled to South Africa, leaving his co-conspirators to face the consequences. Yes, he ran, as such men always run, when the reality of what they have done becomes too terrible to face. And he has been running ever since, hiding from justice, hiding from his conscience,
hiding from the niece who has sworn to destroy him. The revelation about Arthur transformed Poirot's understanding of the case. Vivian Pemberton was not merely seeking revenge against strangers who had wronged her family. She was hunting a blood relative, a man who shared her ancestry and had used that connection to betray his own brother. The personal dimension made the case both more tragic and more dangerous. Vivian's hatred for Arthur would be deeper, more intense, more all-consuming than her hatred for the other conspirators. If she succeeded in reaching him, her revenge would be correspondingly more terrible. And if she failed, Poirot remembered Dr. Weber's warning about what might happen when an obsession is thwarted. If Vivian could not destroy Arthur, she might well destroy herself. Chapter 7. Extended. The Harrington Interview. The interview with Victor Harrington, the banker, had left Poirot with a sense of unease that deepened as he reviewed his notes. Harrington's arrogance, his complete lack of remorse, his dismissal of Marcus Pemberton as merely a wealthy aristocrat who gambled with money he could afford to lose. All of it spoke of a man who had convinced himself that his crimes were justified,
or at least excusable.
but there had been something else in Harrington's manner, something beneath the surface confidence that suggested he was not as secure as he pretended. Poirot decided to investigate the banker's current affairs more thoroughly, suspecting that there might be connections he had not yet discovered. The investigation revealed that Harrington's bank was in financial difficulty. The post-war economy had not been kind to small private banks, and Harrington had made several bad investments that had depleted his reserves. He was facing the prospect of insolvency, a humiliation that would strip away the wealth and status he had spent decades accumulating. "The irony is exquisite," Poirot observed. "The man who helped destroy Marcus Pemberton through financial manipulation is now facing financial destruction himself. One might almost call it justice. Except he's still alive, while 3 other men are dead. True, but his survival may not last much longer. If Vivian knows about his difficulties, and she seems to know everything, she may have adjusted her plans accordingly. Why kill a man who is already destroying himself?" The thought led Poirot to a new hypothesis. What if Vivian's campaign of revenge was not merely about killing the conspirators, but about making them suffer? What if she had been watching them for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, choosing her victims based not just on their guilt, but on their vulnerability? Geoffrey Blake had been racked with guilt, sleeping poorly, tormented by nightmares. He had been an easy target, someone whose psychological defenses were already compromised, who might have welcomed death as a release from his torment. Charles Worthington had been smug and self-satisfied, proud of his role in protecting Ashby's assets. His murder had been a rebuke, a demonstration that even the cleverest legal maneuvering could not protect him from the consequences of his crimes.
Sir Rupert Ashby had been the public face of the conspiracy, the man who had profited most visibly from Marcus Pemberton's destruction. His death had been the opening statement, a declaration that the killing had begun and that no one would be spared. And Edmund Cross, the retired stockbroker, had been living in comfortable denial, tending his roses and pretending the past had never happened. The poisoned wine that had been sent to him was a reminder that there was no escape, no refuge, no garden peaceful enough to hide him from his crimes. Each murder, each attempted murder, had been tailored to its target. Vivian was not merely killing, she was judging, sentencing, executing in a manner that reflected the specific guilt of each victim. She sees herself as an instrument of divine justice, Poirot realized. Each killing is a ritual, a sacrament, a holy act of retribution. The goblets are not merely murder weapons, they are chalices, vessels of sacred punishment that transform poison into purification. The religious dimension added another layer of complexity to the case. If Vivian believed she was doing God's work, conventional appeals to morality or self-interest would be ineffective. She would be immune to remorse, death to pleas for mercy, convinced that any sacrifice, including her own life, was justified in service of her holy mission. Such certainty was almost impossible to overcome. Only confrontation with an equally powerful force, love, perhaps, or family loyalty, might be enough to shake her faith in her own righteousness. Chapter 8. Extended. The search intensifies. The discovery of the calling card at Blake's murder scene had opened new avenues of investigation, but each avenue led to more questions rather than answers. The card itself was a standard design, available from any number of stationers. Tracing its origin proved impossible. But the name it bore, V. Pemberton, was itself a clue. By leaving the card, Vivian had deliberately revealed her connection to the case. She wanted the investigators to know who she was, wanted them to understand the meaning behind her crimes.
She is telling a story, Poirot mused. Each murder is a chapter. Each clue is a detail that advances the narrative. And we, the investigators, are her audience, the witnesses to the justice she believes she is dispensing. But why? Why does she need an audience? Because revenge without recognition is incomplete. If she killed these men in secret, disposing of their bodies in unmarked graves, who would know that justice had been done? Who would understand that Marcus Pemberton's betrayal had finally been avenged? The goblets, the locked rooms, the calling cards, all of it is designed to ensure that her message is received. So, she wants to be caught? She wants to be understood. Whether she wants to be caught is a different question, one that I suspect even she has not fully answered.
The search for Vivian's current whereabouts focused on the identity of Victoria Morrison, the name under which she had collected the items from Lady Ashford's estate. The solicitor's records provided a description. Dark hair, pale complexion, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, well-spoken with a slight foreign accent, that matched what they had learned about Vivian's appearance. But the address Victoria Morrison had provided proved to be false. The references she had given turned out to be fabricated, and no one at the solicitor's office could recall anything specific about her, beyond a general impression of quiet competence.
She was invisible, one of the clerks recalled. The kind of person you look at and immediately forget. Nothing memorable about her at all. That was deliberate, Poirot said. She has spent years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. In a crowd, you would pass her without a second glance. In a conversation,
you would struggle to remember what she had said 5 minutes later. She has made herself a ghost. Present, but invisible. Watching, but unseen. The profile was both helpful and terrifying. A killer who could blend into any environment, who could approach her victims without arousing suspicion, who could disappear the moment the deed was done. Such a person was almost impossible to catch through conventional means. They would have to outthink her. They would have to understand her psychology so thoroughly that they could predict her next move before she made it. And they would have to be willing to take risks, to spring the trap she was setting, even knowing that they might become caught in it themselves. Chapter 9. Extended. The Cousin's History. The relationship between Julian and Vivian Pemberton was a crucial element of the case that Poirot had not fully explored. Both were children of the Pemberton tragedy. Julian through his father Marcus, Vivian through her aunt Victoria and her connection to the family's French branch. Both had lost everything because of the conspiracy of 1929, but while Vivian had channeled her grief into revenge, Julian seemed to have chosen a different path. Poirot sought out people who had known Julian before his disappearance, hoping to understand what had motivated his cousin, and whether he might be willing to help stop her.
Julian was always the quiet one, recalled a former colleague from the shipping company where Julian had worked. He never talked about his family, never mentioned the title or the estates, or any of the things you might expect from someone with his background. He just did his job, kept to himself, and went home at the end of the day. Did he have any close friends? Any confidants? Not really. He was friendly enough, but he kept everyone at arm's length.
I got the impression he was carrying some kind of burden, something he couldn't or wouldn't share with anyone. Did he ever mention his cousin Vivian? Once. We were having drinks after work, and someone made a joke about revenge. I don't remember the context. Julian's face changed, just for a moment. He said something like, "Revenge is a poison that destroys the person who drinks it." Then he changed the subject, and we never spoke of it again. The phrase haunted Poirot. Had Julian been speaking of his cousin? Had he known, even then, what Vivian was planning? And if so, why had he done nothing to stop her, until now? The answer, Poirot suspected, lay in the complicated bonds of family loyalty. Julian had lost his father to the conspiracy, just as Vivian had lost her uncle and her family's honor. He might have understood Vivian's rage, even sympathized with it, while recognizing that her methods were destructive and wrong. He had stayed silent for years, perhaps hoping that Vivian would eventually abandon her plans, or that time would heal the wounds that drove her. When the killings began, he had faced an impossible choice: betray his cousin to the authorities, or become complicit in murder through his silence. His disappearance suggested that he had chosen a third path: to stop Vivian himself, without involving the police, without destroying what remained of his family. It was a noble impulse, perhaps, but it was also dangerous. Vivian was intelligent, resourceful, and utterly committed to her cause. Julian, for all his good intentions, was an amateur, facing a woman who had spent decades preparing for this moment. He is trying to save her, Poirot realized, not just from prison, but from herself. He knows that if she completes her revenge, she will be destroyed by it, consumed by the same poison she has been administering to her victims. He wants to stop her before it is too late. Can he succeed? I do not know, but I think he is our best hope of reaching her, of breaking through the wall of obsession she has built around herself. If anyone can appeal to the human being behind the killer, it is Julian. They share blood, history, grief. That connection may be stronger than her hatred. The insight shaped Poirot's strategy for the final confrontation. Instead of trying to capture Vivian through force or deception, he would use Julian as a bridge, a way to reach the person she had been before revenge consumed her. It was a risky approach. Julian might fail, or might become another victim of Vivian's campaign. But Poirot believed it was their best chance of ending the killings without adding more blood to the toll already paid. Chapter 5. The Pemberton Legacy. The investigation into Lord Marcus Pemberton's family revealed a tragedy that extended far beyond the financial ruin that had claimed his life. Poirot spent a long afternoon in the reading room of the British Library, poring over old newspapers and society pages, piecing together the story of a family destroyed. Lord Marcus had married late in life, wedding a young woman named Elizabeth Forsyth in 1905, when he was already in his 40s and she was barely 20. It had been, by all accounts, a love match, rare among the aristocracy, where marriages were more often arrangements of property and prestige. They had 2 children, a son, Julian, born in 1906, and a daughter, Cecily, born in 1909. The family had been happy, prosperous and prominent in London society until the disaster of 1929. After the collapse, everything changed. Elizabeth Pemberton died within a year, officially of pneumonia, though the newspapers hinted at a broken heart. Lord Marcus descended into poverty and despair, eventually dying in the charity hospital that Poirot had heard about. The children were left to fend for themselves, their inheritance stolen, their family name tainted by scandal.
Julian Pemberton had been 23 at the time of the collapse, old enough to understand what had happened, young enough to have his entire future destroyed by it. He had been studying law at Cambridge with plans to enter the diplomatic service. Instead, he was forced to abandon his education and find work wherever he could. According to the records Poirot had gathered, he had held a series of minor positions over the years: clerk, salesman, junior manager, never achieving the success that his birth and early promise had seemed to guarantee. Cecily Pemberton had been only 20 when her world collapsed. She had been engaged to the son of an earl, a match that would have secured her social position for life. The engagement was broken off within weeks of the scandal, and she had never married. The last record Poirot could find of her was from 1935, when she had been working as a governess for a family in Yorkshire. 2 lives ruined, Poirot murmured, closing the final newspaper. 2 children who lost everything because of their father's trust and his partner's betrayal. Either of them might have reason to seek revenge. But the more pressing question was, where were they now? Julian had disappeared 6 months ago, as Japp had noted. Cecily had dropped out of public records entirely sometime in the late 1930s. Either of them might be the Crystal Goblet Killer, or neither, if the killer was someone else entirely, someone with a different connection to the Pemberton tragedy. Poirot decided to focus his attention on the goblets themselves. If they were the key to the killer's identity, as he suspected, then understanding their history might reveal who now possessed them. The Barovier glassworks on Murano had excellent records. A telegram to their offices produced, within 48 hours, a detailed account of the Goblet Commission. The 12 glasses had been created in 1925 at the personal request of Lord Marcus Pemberton, who had visited Venice during a tour of the Mediterranean. He had designed the goblets himself, specifying the gold filigree pattern that was based on his family's coat of arms. The set had been shipped to his London residence and had remained in his possession until his death. After Lord Marcus died, his possessions had been sold to pay his debts. The goblets had been purchased at auction by an anonymous buyer, represented by a solicitor's firm that had since been dissolved. Tracing the buyer's identity through official channels proved impossible. But Poirot had other methods. The goblets were purchased for £1,500, he told Japp during their next meeting. A substantial sum in 1933, when the economy was still recovering from the Depression. The buyer must have had significant resources and significant motivation to acquire this particular set of glasses.
You think the buyer was the killer?
I think the buyer was connected to the killer, at the very least. Someone wanted those goblets badly enough to pay far more than their market value. Someone who understood their significance and wanted to possess them for reasons that went beyond mere aesthetics.
Could it have been one of the Pemberton children? Julian or Cecily?
They had no money after the collapse. Unless they somehow acquired resources we don't know about, they could not have afforded the purchase.
Poirot paused, considering another possibility.
But someone might have bought the goblets on their behalf. A benefactor, a sympathizer, someone who knew the family and wanted to preserve a piece of their heritage.
Or someone who planned to use them as murder weapons, even back then.
That would suggest a remarkably long-term plan. More than 15 years of preparation before the first killing?
Poirot shook his head.
It is possible, but it seems excessive. No, I believe the goblets were acquired for sentimental reasons initially.
And the idea of using them for murder came later, perhaps much later, as the killer's anger grew and their desire for revenge became irresistible. The investigation took a new turn that afternoon when news arrived of a third murder. Chapter 6. The third victim. Geoffrey Blake had been found dead in his Hampstead home, despite the police guards stationed outside. Like the previous victims, he had been discovered in a locked room, clutching the shattered remains of a crystal goblet. Like them, he had died from cyanide poisoning, the telltale blue tinge around his lips confirming the cause of death. The police guards were mystified. They had seen no one enter or leave the house during their watch. The doors and windows had remained locked. Blake had been alone in his study, working on some private papers, when he had apparently received a visitor. A visitor who had somehow bypassed all security and departed without leaving a trace.
It's impossible,
Japp fumed, pacing the crime scene with mounting frustration.
We had men watching every entrance. No one could have gotten in without being seen.
And yet someone did, Poirot observed, examining the room with meticulous care.
The killer is clearly resourceful, more resourceful than we have given them credit for.
The study was smaller than Ashby's had been, more cluttered with books and papers. Blake had been sitting at his desk when death came, judging by the position of his chair and the papers scattered across the floor. The goblet had shattered on the carpet beside him, its fragments glittering in the afternoon light.
Wait!
Poirot bent down, his attention caught by something beneath the desk.
What is this?
He retrieved a small piece of paper, a calling card, slightly crumpled, bearing a name in elegant script. V. Pemberton.
V. Pemberton?
Japp took the card, turning it over in his hands.
Who is V. Pemberton? Julian's name starts with J, doesn't it? Julian Marcus Pemberton, yes.
But what if there is another Pemberton we have overlooked? A cousin, perhaps, or a more distant relative? Poirot's eyes narrowed.
Or what if V stands not for a first name, but for something else entirely?
Like what?
I do not know, yet, but this card is significant. The killer left it deliberately, I think. They want us to know who they are, or at least to think we know.
That's madness,
Why would a murderer leave evidence pointing to their identity? Because they are confident they will not be caught. Because they believe their revenge is justified and want the world to understand their motives. Or because they are playing a game with us, leaving clues that may or may not lead where they appear to lead. Poirot pocketed the card. We must find this V. Pemberton, whoever they are. They are either our killer or someone who knows the killer's identity. The search for V. Pemberton led Poirot down unexpected paths. The Pemberton family tree was more extensive than he had initially realized, with branches stretching across England and into several European countries. There were cousins, second cousins, and connections by marriage that created a web of relationships difficult to untangle. But one name kept appearing in his research again and again. Victoria Pemberton, Lord Marcus's younger sister, who had married a French diplomat and moved to Paris before the war. She had died in 1940 during the German occupation, but she had left behind a daughter named Vivian, who would now be in her early 30s. Vivian Pemberton, V. Pemberton. She was raised in France, Poirot explained to Japp, laying out the genealogical charts he had assembled. Her mother died when she was young, and she was brought up by relatives in Paris. But she returned to England after the war. The records show she entered the country in 1946 and has been living here ever since. Where is she now? That is what we must discover.
She is not listed in any current directory, and her last known address is no longer valid. But she is here, Japp. I am certain of it, and she is connected to these murders in some way. You think she's the killer? I think she is involved. Whether as the killer, as an accomplice, or as something else entirely, I cannot yet say. But the calling card was left for a reason. V. Pemberton wants us to find her, or wants us to think we can find her. It could be a trap. Almost certainly, but we must spring it nonetheless. The killer has claimed 3 victims already, and the remaining conspirators are running out of time. If we do not act quickly, more people will die. The search for Vivian Pemberton consumed the next several days. Poirot deployed all his resources: contacts in the police, private inquiry agents, connections in society who might have crossed paths with a young Frenchwoman of aristocratic background. Gradually, a picture began to emerge. Vivian had arrived in England as a refugee, traumatized by her experiences during the occupation and grieving for her mother. She had been taken in by distant relatives, the Ashfords, who had provided her with a home and an education. She had shown a talent for languages and had worked as a translator for several years before disappearing from public view in the early 1950s. The Ashfords, Poirot repeated, studying the report. That name is familiar. Were they connected to the Pemberton affair? His assistant, a young man named Hastings, the nephew of his old friend Captain Hastings, consulted his notes. Yes, sir. Lady Margaret Ashford was a close friend of Elizabeth Pemberton, Lord Marcus's wife. She was one of the few society figures who stood by the family after the scandal. And she took in Vivian after the war. Interesting. Poirot stroked his moustache thoughtfully. Lady Ashford would have told Vivian about the Pemberton tragedy, about how her uncle was destroyed by his treacherous partners. She would have grown up knowing the story, knowing the names of the men responsible. But that doesn't mean she became a murderer. No, But it means she had knowledge and motivation. Combined with access to the goblets, which she might have inherited or acquired through Lady Ashford's connections, it makes her a significant suspect.
So where is she now?
That is the question. We have traced her movements up to 1952, when she left the Ashford household. After that, she simply vanishes. No employment records, no address registrations, no official documents of any kind. It is as though she ceased to exist.
Or took on a new identity.
Precisely. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden insight.
She changed her name. She became someone else. Someone who could move through London society without being recognized as a Pemberton, without being connected to the scandal that destroyed her family. But who? How do we find someone who doesn't want to be found? We look for the gaps, mon ami. The places where a person should be, but is not. The connections that should exist, but do not.
Poirot rose from his chair, his manner suddenly decisive.
I must visit the remaining conspirators again. One of them may have encountered Vivian without knowing who she really was. If I can establish a connection between her and the victims, I may be able to identify the identity she has assumed.
Chapter 7. The Hidden Connection. Edmund Cross, the retired stockbroker, lived in a rambling country house in Sussex, surrounded by the rose gardens that had become his obsession since leaving the city. He was a changed man from the one who had manipulated stock prices to trigger the Pemberton collapse. Older, softer, seemingly at peace with himself and his past. But appearances, as Poirot well knew, could be deceiving. "I've told you everything I know," Cross insisted, his voice querulous. "I don't remember any Vivian Pemberton. I didn't have any contact with the family after the collapse. I just want to be left alone to tend my roses."
And yet the killer continues to strike, Monsieur Cross. 3 of your former associates are dead. You may well be next.
I have guards. I have security. I haven't let anyone into this house except police officers and my own servants.
Have you received any gifts recently? Any packages, any deliveries that you were not expecting?
Cross hesitated. There was one thing. About a week ago, a package arrived, a bottle of vintage wine, supposedly from an old friend. I was going to open it, but then the news came about Worthington's death, and I thought better of it.
Where is this wine now?
In the cellar. I told the servants to leave it alone until I decided what to do with it.
Show me.
The wine cellar was cool and dark, lined with racks holding hundreds of bottles. Cross led Poirot to a far corner, where a single bottle stood apart from the others. A dusty Bordeaux with a handwritten label. "This is it." The card said it was from an old Cambridge friend, but when I tried to contact him, I discovered he'd been dead for 5 years. Poirot examined the bottle without touching it.
And you did not think this suspicious?
Of course I thought it suspicious. That's why I didn't open it. But I didn't connect it to the murders until later. I thought perhaps someone was playing a joke, or that there had been some mistake.
A joke that might have killed you, Monsieur Cross.
Poirot turned to the police officer who had accompanied them.
Have this bottle tested immediately. I suspect we will find it contains enough cyanide to kill 12 men.
The bottle did indeed contain poison, not in the wine itself, but in a false bottom of the glass that would have released its contents when the bottle was opened. It was an ingenious delivery system, one that would have allowed the killer to murder Cross without ever entering his home.
"She's adapting," Poirot told Japp when they met that evening. "The killer knows we've increased security, so she's finding new ways to reach her victims. Poisoned wine, poisoned gifts, anything that can bypass the guards we've put in place."
She? You're certain the killer is Vivian Pemberton?
"I am increasingly certain, yes. The methodology, the patience, the attention to detail, all of it speaks of someone who has been planning this for a very long time. Vivienne lost her mother during the war, lost her family legacy because of the Pemberton scandal, lost everything that should have been hers. This is her revenge, carefully planned, meticulously executed, and designed not just to kill, but to send a message."
What message?
"That the sins of the past cannot be escaped, that justice, however delayed, will eventually be served, that those who destroyed Marcus Pemberton will themselves be destroyed, using the very symbols of what they stole from him."
Poirot paused.
"The goblets are the key to understanding her psychology. She uses them not just as murder weapons, but as instruments of judgment. Each victim is made to drink from the cup that represents their victim's family, to consume their own guilt, quite literally, before dying."
It's madness.
"It is a particular kind of logic, the logic of obsession, of trauma, of grief transformed into fury. Vivienne Pemberton has spent decades nursing her hatred, planning her revenge, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now that moment has come."
How do we stop her?
"By finding her before she can strike again, and by understanding, finally, who helped her acquire the goblets, and who has been protecting her identity all these years."
Poirot's expression was grave.
"Someone in London knows who Vivienne has become. Someone has been sheltering her, enabling her, perhaps even assisting in her crimes. We must find that person, and through them
Find the killer." Chapter 8. The Accomplice. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Young Hastings, pursuing a line of inquiry that Poirot had suggested, almost as an afterthought, discovered a connection between Vivienne Pemberton and one of London's most respected charitable organisations, the Widows and Orphans Relief Fund, which provided assistance to families affected by financial hardship.
"She worked there for 3 years in the late 1940s,
Hastings reported.
under the name Vivienne Ashford. She apparently used her adoptive family's surname. And guess who was on the board of directors during that time?
Tell me.
Lady Catherine Harrington, wife of Victor Harrington, the banker."
Poirot sat back in his chair, his grey cells suddenly electric with new connections.
Lady Harrington. She would have known Vivienne, would have worked with her, perhaps even become close to her. And through Lady Harrington, Vivienne would have had access to information about her husband's role in the Pemberton affair. It gets better. Lady Harrington resigned from the charity's board in 1951, the same year Vivienne Ashford left her position. And, according to the charity's records, they remained in contact afterward. There are letters, Christmas cards, evidence of an ongoing relationship. Lady Harrington has been in contact with the killer for years.
Poirot rose from his chair, his manner suddenly urgent.
"We must speak with her immediately. If she knows where Vivienne is, if she has been helping her, then she may be the key to ending this nightmare."
Lady Catherine Harrington received them in the drawing room of her Mayfair townhouse.
a space decorated with exquisite taste and old money. She was a handsome woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the composed manner of someone accustomed to privilege and position. "Monsieur Poirot, I've been expecting you, I suppose."
You've discovered my connection to Vivienne. You do not deny it? What would be the point? You clearly know more than I anticipated. Yes, I knew Vivienne Pemberton. Knew her as Vivienne Ashford, at least, when she worked at the charity. She was a remarkable young woman, intelligent, compassionate, dedicated to helping others who had suffered as her family had suffered. And you knew her true identity. You knew she was Marcus Pemberton's niece. Lady Harrington hesitated. I discovered it eventually. She told me herself, after we had become friends. She trusted me with her secret. Trusted that I would not reveal it to my husband or anyone else connected to the old scandal. But your husband was one of the men who destroyed her family. I know. Lady Harrington's composure cracked, just slightly. I've lived with that knowledge for 20 years, Monsieur Poirot. My husband's role in the Pemberton affair, I discovered it long after we were married, long after I had built my life around him. What was I supposed to do? Leave him? Expose him? Destroy my own family to avenge someone else's? So you said nothing. I said nothing. But I tried to make amends in my own way, by helping Vivienne, by being her friend, by giving her support that I could not give openly. Lady Harrington's voice dropped. I loved her like a daughter. When she left London, I was devastated. Where did she go? I don't know. Truly, I don't. She wrote to me occasionally over the years, never with a return address, never with any indication of where she was living. The letters were postmarked from different cities: Paris, Rome, Vienna. She seemed to be travelling, searching for something. I never knew what. When did the letters stop? About a year ago. I wrote to her usual contact address, but my letter was returned unopened. I assumed she had simply moved on, that she no longer needed my friendship. But now... Lady Harrington's face crumpled. Now I realize what she was doing, what she was planning. And I helped her, didn't I? All those years of friendship, all those letters where I told her about London society, about my husband's business, about the men who had destroyed her family. I gave her the information she needed to become a killer. Did you give her the goblets as well? The question hit Lady Harrington like a physical blow. The goblets? What do you mean? The crystal goblets that were commissioned by Lord Marcus Pemberton. The ones being used to kill his former partners. Someone purchased them at auction in 1933, and someone has been keeping them safe ever since. Was it you? No, I never... Lady Harrington stopped, her expression shifting from shock to dawning horror. But I know who did. Oh God, I know who bought them. Who? Lady Margaret Ashford, Vivienne's guardian. She mentioned it once, years ago, when we were discussing the Pemberton tragedy. She said she had purchased some of Marcus's personal effects at the estate sale, wanted to preserve them for the family, for when times were better. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now... Lady Ashford gave the goblets to Vivienne. She must have. When she died, a few years ago, she left everything to Vivienne in her will. Everything, including, I suppose, the goblets that are now being used as murder weapons. Lady Harrington covered her face with her hands. I've been such a fool. I thought I was helping a wounded girl find peace. Instead, I was nurturing a monster. Chapter 9. The Silent Partner. The investigation into Lady Margaret Ashford's estate confirmed Lady Harrington's account. The elderly benefactress had indeed purchased several items from the Pemberton collection, including the set of 12 crystal goblets. Upon her death in 1954, these items had passed to her ward, Vivian Pemberton, who was listed in the will as Vivian Ashford, née Pemberton, my beloved goddaughter. "We have our killer," Japp declared. Vivian Pemberton, using her adoptive name to conceal her identity, has been murdering the men who destroyed her family. All we need to do now is find her.
It is not quite so simple, Poirot cautioned. We know who the killer is, yes, but we do not yet understand the full scope of her plan. Remember, there were 7 conspirators in the original scheme. 3 are dead. 1 is in South Africa, and 2 remain under protection. But the 7th, the silent partner, has never been identified. You think Vivian knows who the silent partner was? I think she must. Her campaign of revenge has been too thorough, too well planned, to have overlooked such a crucial figure. She has spent years researching the conspiracy, gathering information, preparing for this moment. If anyone knows the silent partner's identity, it is Vivian.
Then maybe that's how we find her. If we can identify the silent partner ourselves, we might be able to predict where Vivian will strike next.
An excellent thought, mon ami. And I believe I have an idea of where to look.
Poirot's investigation into the silent partner took him back to the financial records of the Pemberton collapse. Records that had been sealed for decades, but that Inspector Japp's authority was able to unseal. The documents told a story of breathtaking corruption, with money flowing through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts that would have taken years to unravel. But Poirot was not interested in following the money. He was interested in finding the one person who had been present at every crucial meeting, who had witnessed every key decision, who had access to information that even the conspirators themselves might not have possessed. The solicitor who had structured the original partnership. Charles Worthington had handled the legal work for the conspiracy, but he had not been the only lawyer involved. There had been another firm retained by the silent partner to represent their interests, a firm that had operated under a veil of secrecy so complete that even Worthington had not known who they ultimately represented. The firm was Blackwood and Associates, and it was still in operation, under the leadership of the founder's son, Reginald Blackwood. Poirot visited the firm's offices in a quiet square near the Inns of Court. Reginald Blackwood was a man in his 50s, with the cautious manner of someone who had spent his life handling sensitive information. "I cannot discuss the affairs of our clients, Monsieur Poirot. Solicitor-client privilege applies even after death."
Even when those affairs may be connected to multiple murders?
Blackwood's expression flickered. "I have read about the Crystal Goblet Killer, of course. Terrible business. But I fail to see how it could be connected to our firm."
Your father represented the silent partner in the Pemberton conspiracy of 1929. The partner who provided the capital took the largest share of the profits and has never been identified. That partner is almost certainly the next target of the killer, and possibly the key to understanding the entire case.
My father handled many sensitive matters over the years. I cannot simply reveal.
3 people are dead, Monsieur Blackwood. 3 more may die if we do not act quickly. I am not asking you to betray your professional obligations. I am asking you to help prevent further bloodshed.
The solicitor was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing duties. Finally, he rose and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner of his office.
My father left instructions to be followed in the event of certain circumstances. He was not proud of everything he did during his career, and he wanted to ensure that the truth would eventually come out, when it was safe, when the principals involved were no longer at risk of prosecution.
Blackwood retrieved a sealed envelope from the cabinet. This envelope contains information about the silent partner in the Pemberton affair. My father instructed me to open it only if the matter became relevant to a criminal investigation.
And now it has.
And now it has. Blackwood broke the seal with trembling hands. Let us see what secrets my father left behind. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, covered in the elder Blackwood's careful handwriting. Poirot read it with growing astonishment, his grey cells struggling to absorb the implications of what he was seeing.
Mon Dieu,
he breathed.
This changes everything.
The silent partner in the Pemberton conspiracy had been none other than Marcus Pemberton himself. Not the Lord Marcus Pemberton, who had been destroyed by the scheme, but his brother, Arthur Pemberton, who had used his position within the family to manipulate events from the beginning. Arthur had not merely betrayed his brother by encouraging the fatal investment. He had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, using Ashby and the others as instruments of his own ambition. Arthur Pemberton had wanted his brother's title, his estate, his position in society, and he had systematically destroyed Marcus to get them, only to discover, too late, that the estate was mortgaged to the hilt, and the title came with nothing but debt and disgrace.
Arthur Pemberton was the mastermind,
Poirot told Japp when they met that evening.
He used Ashby's greed, Worthington's cunning, and his brother's trust to execute a scheme that was supposed to make him wealthy and powerful. Instead, it destroyed everything, including, eventually, Arthur himself, who fled to South Africa to escape the consequences of what he had done.
And Vivian knows this?
She must.
Lady Harrington said Vivian had spent years researching the conspiracy, gathering information, preparing for her revenge. She would have discovered Arthur's role eventually, would have understood that the greatest betrayal came not from strangers, but from her own family.
So Arthur Pemberton is the final target. He is the ultimate target, the man who destroyed his own brother, who murdered him as surely as if he had put a gun to his head. Vivian has been saving him for last, the culmination of her revenge, the final act in a drama that has been decades in the making. But Arthur is in South Africa. How can she reach him there?
Poirot's expression was grim.
I do not think she intends to go to South Africa, mon ami. I think she has found a way to bring Arthur to her.
Chapter 10. The Trap.
The telegram arrived the following morning, addressed to Arthur Pemberton at his residence in Johannesburg. It was brief and devastating. Julian dead. Come immediately. V. Julian Pemberton, Arthur's nephew, Lord Marcus's son, the young man who had disappeared 6 months ago and had never been found. If he was truly dead, Arthur would have no choice but to return to England to settle his affairs. But Poirot did not believe Julian was dead. He believed the telegram was a trap, a lure designed to draw Arthur Pemberton back to England, where Vivian would be waiting with her crystal goblet and her carefully prepared poison.
We need to find Vivian before Arthur arrives, Poirot told Japp. She will have prepared everything, a location, a method, a way to ensure that her final victim cannot escape. If we can find that location, we can set our own trap. How? We've been searching for her for weeks and found nothing. We have been searching for Vivian Pemberton, but she has not been living as Vivian Pemberton. She has been living as someone else. Someone who can move through society without suspicion. We must ask ourselves, who is that person? What identity has she assumed? Poirot returned to the evidence, reviewing everything they had gathered about Vivian's movements and connections. She had worked at the charity under the name Vivian Ashford. She had received letters from Lady Harrington at various addresses across Europe. She had inherited the goblets from Lady Margaret Ashford's estate. And then, suddenly, he saw it. The solicitor who handled Lady Ashford's estate, Poirot said slowly. Who was it? Hastings consulted his notes. A firm called Morrison and Associates. They handled the probate and distributed the bequests. Contact them. Find out who collected the items left to Vivian Pemberton. I want a name, an address, a description, anything they can provide. The solicitor's records provided exactly what Poirot had hoped for. The items from Lady Ashford's estate had been collected by a woman calling herself Victoria Morrison, supposedly a distant relative who had been authorized to act on Vivian's behalf. Victoria Morrison. V. She used her own initial, Poirot mused. The same initial as on the calling card left at Blake's murder scene. She wants us to find her, Jap. Wants us to understand who she is and what she has done. This is not merely revenge. It is a statement, a declaration of identity. Victoria Morrison. Is that her current name? Almost certainly. And if she has been using it consistently, there will be records, an address, employment, something that will lead us to her. The search for Victoria Morrison produced results within hours. She was listed in the London Directory as residing in a flat in Bloomsbury, a modest address for someone who had inherited valuable crystal goblets, but consistent with someone who wished to avoid attention. Poirot and Jap, accompanied by a team of police officers, arrived at the Bloomsbury address that afternoon. The flat was on the third floor of a Victorian building, its windows overlooking a quiet square. There was no answer when they knocked, but the building's caretaker was able to provide a key. The flat was empty, but not abandoned. The furniture was still in place, the kitchen still stocked with food, the wardrobe still filled with women's clothing. On the mantelpiece, displayed like trophies, stood 9 crystal goblets, their gold filigree glittering in the afternoon light. 9 goblets, Poirot counted. 3 have been used already, on Ashby, Worthington and Blake. That leaves these 9, plus the poison that was sent across. She intended to kill them all, eventually. But where is she now? Poirot examined the flat more carefully, looking for any clue to Vivian's current whereabouts. On the desk, he found a folder containing newspaper clippings about the murders, along with detailed notes on each of the conspirators, their addresses, their habits, their weaknesses. There were also photographs, apparently taken surreptitiously, showing the victims going about their daily lives. And at the bottom of the folder, a single sheet of paper bearing an address in Hampstead, the address of a house that Poirot recognized immediately. This is Geoffrey Blake's house, but Blake is already dead. Look at the date, Jap said, pointing to a notation in the corner of the sheet. This was written 3 days ago, after Blake's murder. Then why would she still have his address? Unless... Poirot's eyes widened. Unless she is planning to use the house for something else. Blake lived alone. His property would be empty now, undisturbed.
a perfect location for a private meeting or a final confrontation. You think she's planning to kill Arthur there? I think she is planning to complete her revenge there. The house where one of her victims died, using the goblets that belonged to her uncle. It has a certain poetic symmetry. Then we need to get there before Arthur does. But even as they rushed toward Hampstead, Poirot knew they might already be too late. Arthur Pemberton had received the telegram hours ago. If he had caught the first available flight, he could already be in London. And Vivian, who had been planning this moment for years, would not have left anything to chance. Chapter 11. The Final Goblet. The Blake house was dark when they arrived, its windows shuttered against the evening light. The police guards who had been stationed there after the murder had been withdrawn once the investigation moved elsewhere, leaving the property unattended. Poirot approached the front door with caution. It was unlocked, not forced, but simply left open, as though inviting visitors to enter. "She's expecting us," he murmured. "Or expecting someone, at least." They entered the house in silence, moving through the darkened hallway toward the study where Geoffrey Blake had died. Light flickered beneath the closed door. Candlelight, Poirot judged, not electric. Someone was inside. He pushed open the door and found himself facing a scene that might have been staged for maximum dramatic effect. The study had been transformed. Candles burned on every surface, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The furniture had been rearranged to create a kind of stage, with two chairs facing each other across a small table. On the table stood a single crystal goblet, filled with dark red wine. And in one of the chairs sat a woman in her 30s, with dark hair and pale skin, and eyes that burned with an intensity that made Poirot's blood run cold. She wore a black dress, elegant and severe, and her hands were folded in her lap with perfect composure. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice clear and controlled. "I wondered when you would arrive. Please, come in. We have much to discuss before my final guest arrives." Vivian Pemberton. Victoria Morrison, actually. I haven't used the Pemberton name in years. It carries too much baggage. She smiled, a thin, cold expression that held no warmth. "But yes, I am the woman you have been searching for. The Crystal Goblet Killer, as the newspapers call me. Such a dramatic name. I rather like it." "You admit to the murders?" "I admit to executing justice. The men I killed were murderers themselves. They destroyed my uncle, drove him to poverty and despair, killed him as surely as if they had put poison in his wine. I merely returned the favor." 3 men are dead because of you. 3 men who deserved to die. And soon there will be a 4th, the worst of them all, the one who orchestrated everything from the beginning. Arthur Pemberton, my own great-uncle, who betrayed his brother for money and power, and got neither. Vivian's voice hardened. "He will drink from the last goblet tonight, Monsieur Poirot, and then my work will be complete." "Arthur is not coming. The telegram you sent was intercepted. He never received it." For the first time, Vivian's composure cracked. "You're lying." "I am not. Arthur Pemberton is still in South Africa, unaware of the trap you set for him. Your revenge is incomplete, and it will remain incomplete. The police are here. You are surrounded. There is no escape." Vivian was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the goblet before her. Then,
Slowly, she reached out and lifted it from the table. If I cannot have Arthur, I will have myself. I have been preparing for this moment my entire life, Monsieur Poirot. I will not let it end in a prison cell. Do not do this. Poirot stepped forward, his voice urgent. Whatever crimes you have committed, whatever wrongs you believe you have avenged, suicide is not the answer. Put down the goblet. Let the law decide your fate. The law? Vivian laughed bitterly. The law that protected the men who destroyed my family. The law that let them walk free, while my uncle died in poverty and my mother fled to France, and my cousin disappeared into obscurity. That law has no claim on me, Monsieur Poirot. I have made my own justice, and I will accept my own punishment. She raised the goblet to her lips. Wait! The voice came from behind Poirot, a man's voice, familiar but unexpected. Vivienne, don't. Poirot turned and saw, standing in the doorway, a man he had not expected to see again. Julian Pemberton, Lord Marcus's son, the cousin who had disappeared 6 months ago.
Julian?
Vivian's voice was barely a whisper.
But the telegram said...
I wrote the telegram, Vivian. I wrote it because I knew it was the only way to stop you. Julian stepped into the room, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief. I've been watching you for months, trying to find a way to end this before it went too far. But you were always one step ahead of me, always moving, always planning. When you killed Blake, I knew I had to act, had to bring you to a place where I could reach you, where I could try to save you from yourself.
Save me?
Vivian's voice cracked with fury.
I don't need saving. I need justice. I need revenge. I need to finish what I started.
What you started was madness, Vivian. Yes, our family was wronged. Yes, the men you killed were guilty. But this... He gestured at the goblet, at the candlelit room, at the scene of carefully staged death. This is not justice. This is obsession. This is the same poison that destroyed our uncle, transformed into a different kind of destruction.
You don't understand. You weren't there. You didn't see what they did to him.
I saw what they did to my father. I saw him lose everything. His money, his future, his hope. I grew up in the shadow of that loss, Vivian. I know what it means to be a Pemberton in a world that has no use for us. Julian's voice softened. But I also know that revenge doesn't heal anything. It just creates more wounds, more pain, more broken people like us. Vivian stared at her cousin, the goblet trembling in her hands. For a moment, Poirot thought she might yield, might set down the poison and surrender to the law she despised. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head. I've come too far to stop now. I've given up everything for this. My name, my life, my future. If I can't complete my revenge, then I have nothing left. You have me. Julian stepped closer, his hand outstretched. You have family, Vivian. Broken, damaged family, but family nonetheless. We can survive this together. Find a way to live with what's been done to us and what you've done in response. But not if you drink from that goblet. Not if you end everything here. The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of grief and rage and loss. Poirot held his breath, aware that everything hung in the balance, that the next few seconds would determine whether the Crystal Goblet Killer claimed one final victim. And then, slowly, Vivian lowered the goblet.
"I can't," she whispered. "I can't stop. Not now. Not after everything." But even as she spoke, Julian moved, faster than Poirot would have thought possible, and knocked the goblet from her hands. It fell to the floor and shattered, spilling its poisoned contents across the carpet in a dark, spreading stain. Vivian collapsed into Julian's arms, sobbing, the first genuine emotion Poirot had seen from her since they entered the room. "It's over," Julian said, holding her tightly. "It's over, Vivian. Let it be over." Chapter 12. Justice and Mercy. The trial of Vivian Pemberton, Victoria Morrison as she was legally known, was one of the most sensational in London's history, attracting journalists and spectators from across Europe and beyond. The story of her decades-long quest for revenge, her meticulous planning, her cold-blooded execution of 3 murders captivated the public imagination and dominated the newspapers for weeks on end. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she made no attempt to deny her crimes. She testified in her own defense, not to claim innocence, but to explain, to make the world understand why she had done what she had done, and what had been done to her family to drive her to such extremes. Her testimony was devastating. She described her uncle's slow destruction at the hands of his supposed friends, the systematic looting of his assets, the final betrayal by his own brother. She spoke of her mother's flight to France, of her own traumatic childhood during the occupation, of the years spent piecing together the truth about her family's downfall. And she explained, in chilling detail, how she had planned and executed each murder. The careful selection of victims, the symbolic use of the goblets, the theatrical staging designed to send a message that could not be ignored. "I am not sorry for what I did," she told the court. "The men I killed were murderers themselves, protected by wealth and status and a legal system that serves the powerful at the expense of the powerless. They deserved to die, and if I had the chance, I would kill them again." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, acknowledged the extraordinary and tragic circumstances of the case, but emphasized firmly that vigilante justice could never be condoned in a civilized society, regardless of the provocation that might inspire it. "Whatever wrongs were done to your family," he told Vivian, "they did not give you the right to take the law into your own hands. Murder is murder, regardless of the victim's character, and society cannot function if individuals are permitted to decide who deserves to live and who deserves to die." He sentenced her to death, a sentence that was later commuted to life imprisonment after a public campaign that attracted supporters from across the political spectrum. Vivian Pemberton became a symbol for some of the injustices perpetuated by the wealthy elite throughout history, and for others, a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal grievance to override the rule of law. Newspapers debated her case for months, with editorials arguing passionately on both sides of the question. Arthur Pemberton, the silent partner who had orchestrated the original conspiracy and betrayed his own brother for personal gain, was never brought to justice for his crimes. He remained in South Africa, beyond the reach of British law and British courts, until his death in 1962 from natural causes. According to those who knew him, he lived his final years in fear. Fear of the niece who had sworn to destroy him, fear of the consequences of his own actions, fear of the justice that he had escaped but that haunted him nonetheless. Julian Pemberton testified on his cousin's behalf at her trial, describing her traumatic history and arguing for mercy. His intervention did not save her from conviction, but it may have contributed to the commutation of her sentence.
After the trial, he returned to the quiet life he had been living before Vivian's campaign of revenge, a life of modest employment and careful anonymity, far from the world of wealth and power that had destroyed his father. Victor Harrington and Edmund Cross, the two surviving conspirators, both died within a year of Vivian's conviction. Harrington of a heart attack, Cross of cancer. Some speculated that the stress of the investigation and the trial had contributed to their deaths. Others saw it as a kind of delayed justice, the universe completing what Vivian had been prevented from finishing. And Hercule Poirot, who had tracked the Crystal Goblet Killer through the labyrinth of her crimes with his characteristic brilliance and determination, returned to his London flat to reflect on what he had witnessed and what lessons might be drawn from it. "It is a case without heroes," he told his young friend Hastings one evening as they sat together over glasses of tisane in the comfortable sitting room of his Whitehaven Mansions flat. Vivian Pemberton was a murderer, yes, but she was also a victim shaped by traumas and losses that were not of her making. The men she killed were guilty of terrible things, of fraud, betrayal, and the deliberate destruction of innocent lives. But their deaths solved nothing, healed nothing, and ultimately changed nothing in the grand scheme of justice. And the true architect of the tragedy, Arthur Pemberton, who had betrayed his own flesh and blood for power and profit, escaped punishment entirely, dying peacefully in his bed, while his victims rotted in their graves. "Is that justice?" young Hastings asked, his face troubled by the moral complexities of the case. "It is the law, which is not always the same thing as true justice," Poirot replied, with a weary sigh. "The law punishes those it can catch, not always those who most deserve punishment. It protects the powerful and wealthy, while leaving the weak and powerless to fend for themselves as best they can. It is an imperfect instrument, wielded by imperfect human beings in a world that is itself deeply and perhaps irredeemably flawed. But surely some measure of justice, however imperfect, is better than none at all? Perhaps it is so. Or perhaps the pursuit of justice, when it becomes an all-consuming obsession, as it did for Vivian Pemberton, is itself a form of destruction that corrupts the pursuer as thoroughly as it punishes the pursued. Vivian Pemberton spent her entire adult life seeking revenge for the wrongs done to her family, sacrificing everything she might have become for the satisfaction of killing men who were already old and would soon have died anyway of natural causes. Was that truly justice? Or was it merely another tragedy, piled atop the mountain of tragedies that began with Marcus Pemberton's betrayal by those he trusted most? Hastings had no answer to this profound question, and Poirot did not truly expect one to be forthcoming. Some questions, he had learned through long experience, had no satisfactory answers at all. They could only be contemplated in silence, considered from every angle, and ultimately set aside as the living continued with the necessary business of living their lives. The Crystal Goblet Killer case was officially closed, its files sealed and archived in the records of Scotland Yard. The goblets themselves, those 9 beautiful, deadly vessels that remained after 3 had been shattered in the act of murder, were donated to a museum specializing in decorative arts, where they were displayed as artifacts of a crime that had captivated an entire nation. Visitors came to see them, these beautiful objects that had been instruments of death, and to wonder at the strange alchemy that could transform art into murder and grief into obsession. And somewhere, in a prison cell, Vivian Pemberton sat alone with her memories, contemplating the revenge she had achieved, and the revenge that had been denied her.
the uncle she had avenged, and the great-uncle who had escaped her justice. She would spend the rest of her life in that cell, thinking those thoughts, and no one would ever know whether she found peace with what she had done, or whether the hunger for vengeance continued to burn within her until the very end. That, Poirot reflected as he sat alone in his flat that evening, was perhaps the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of the human heart, with its infinite capacity for both love and hatred, for creation and destruction, for redemption and damnation. He had solved the case of the Crystal Goblet Killer, had unraveled the web of conspiracy and revenge that had claimed so many lives. But the deeper questions, about justice and mercy, about the wounds that never heal, about the poison of obsession that can destroy both victim and avenger, those questions remained unanswered, and perhaps always would. The grey cells could solve crimes, but they could not heal souls. That work required a different kind of intelligence, one that Poirot, for all his brilliance, had never fully mastered. Outside his window, London continued its eternal business. The traffic, the pedestrians, the vast machine of civilization, grinding forward regardless of the tragedies that occurred within it. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new puzzles, new opportunities to exercise the gifts that had made him famous. But tonight, Poirot sat with the weight of the Crystal Goblet Killer case upon him, contemplating the thin line that separated justice from vengeance, and wondering whether any of them, investigators or criminals, victims or avengers, truly understood the difference. The goblets were shattered now, their deadly purpose concluded. But the questions they raised would endure. Questions about family and betrayal, about patience and obsession, about the terrible price of revenge, and the even more terrible price of letting injustice stand. Such questions, Poirot knew, had no easy answers. They could only be lived with, contemplated, and eventually set aside as the living went on with the business of living. The dead would remain dead, the guilty would face whatever judgment awaited them, and the world would continue to turn, indifferent to the small dramas of human grief and human vengeance that played out within it, and one that even his grey cells could not hope to solve. Thank you for joining us on The Little Grey Cells for the Crystal Goblet Killer. If this tale of shattered glass and shattered lives captured your imagination, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Was Vivian Pemberton a monster or a victim, or perhaps something of both? A woman warped by tragedy into an instrument of destruction? Did the men she killed deserve their fate, or does justice demand something more than vengeance, something higher than an eye for an eye? And what do you think became of Julian Pemberton, the cousin who risked everything to save a woman who might have been beyond saving? These questions have no easy answers, but they are worth contemplating nonetheless, for they touch upon the deepest mysteries of the human condition, the capacity for both good and evil that exists within each of us, and the choices that determine which path we ultimately follow. We love hearing from fellow mystery enthusiasts, and your engagement helps us bring more tales of the little Belgian detective to life. The world of Hercule Poirot is vast and fascinating, filled with puzzles that challenge the mind and dilemmas that trouble the conscience. Each case reveals something new about human nature, about the hidden depths that lie beneath the surface of civilized society, about the passions and resentments that can fester for years before erupting into violence. Until next time, keep those grey cells active. Remember that the most beautiful objects can conceal the darkest purposes, and trust that justice, however imperfect,
is always worth pursuing. The goblets may be shattered, but the truth endures. And as long as there are mysteries to solve and wrongs to right, Hercule Poirot will be there, bringing his unique combination of brilliance and compassion to bear on the problems that confound lesser minds. Farewell, dear listeners, and we shall see you in the next mystery.